welcome. Hopefully you can hear me all right. We'll make a start. So if you've just joined us a little bit later, we've got Luc here who's actually sitting opposite me, and he's going to talk to us about the distinct formation history of deep mantle domains reflected in geochemical differences. So Luc, I'll just unmute you.
Thank you.
Hear yourself. If everybody else can just for now turn their webcams off, you can turn them on at the end when there's questions.
Okay. So I think you can hear me. Yes. Okay. Good. So thank you everybody to join me today to present distinct formation history for a deep mantle domain reflected in geochemical differences. So I remember I gave a talk to the EPS, I think nearly 2 years ago, in October, if I remember correctly. So it was just after I arrived in Curtin, and I remember during that talk I make a lot of promises, and I say I will do a lot of stuff, and I'm really happy to present the outcome of that research. So part of the outcome. So basically, this is the title of the paper that has been recently published in Nature Geoscience. So okay. Oh, can I just okay? Okay, it's working. So this is the title of the paper, and you have the list of all the co-authors. So as you can see, using the names and using all the logos, it's a team effort. So for that work, we work with different people from different places, almost all over the world, and it was really nice. A nice story and a nice journey to publish that paper. So what I would start to do is to give you some background about that paper, to explain why we wanted to explore the mantle geochemistry, yes, and heterogeneity, and what they're linked with plate tectonics, supercontinent cycles, and stuff. So for a start, we just have a look at the Earth's mantle structures and also what we call the mantle domain. So on the left side, you have a map of the Earth with a representation of the tomography at 2,800 kilometers deep, so at the core mantle boundary. You have in red what we called the LLSVP, so the Large Low Shear Velocity Province. So as we call them LLSVP. So you have the African LLSVP below Africa, and you have the Pacific LLSVP below the Pacific. And very interestingly, these two domains are, these two LSVPs are antipodal. If you put that on the globe, you will see that these two LSVP are opposite to each other. And they are separated by the Pacific Ring of Fire, or what we call the subduction girdle, so which encompass all the continent today. So from Asia, Australia, and all the North America and South America. And this girdle, this subduction girdle, define the two domains, the Pacific domain and the African domains, in which you can find the LLSVPs. So see, this is the basic structure of the Earth. So it's on the first order, when you look at the Earth as a whole. And the big question is, so we know that there is a relationship. We see that we have like subduction girdle, we have the continents, we have the LLSVP, and the big question is, what's the nature and evolution of the LLSVPs, or how we call them the superplumes. I will explain a bit later what we call them the superplumes. And we want to understand what the link with the plate tectonics, and also what's going on when we have the supercontinent cycles. That's the background for the story. So first, to make sure that we understand what we are all on the same page about what we call the supercontinent. So the supercontinent, they are when you have the majority of the land masses bring back together. Like when you have Pangea, you have like 75% of the continent brought together. And the supercontinent cycles is what it's divided into different parts. You have like the assembly of the supercontinent, when you have like the masses moving together when you form this supercontinent. You have the tenure, when you have this landmass, which are a coherent, big continent. And we have the breakup, when these blocks will go apart. And on Earth, we had several supercontinents. If we start from the most recent one, we have Pangea. And before that, we had Rodinia. And before Rodinia, we had Nuna. And before Nuna, it's a bit controversial. It was, do we have supercontinent? Do we have supercratons? It's still a matter of debate, but what we know that we had at least 3 supercontinents. And something very interesting is the periodicity between each supercontinent. We have what we call the supercontinental cycles, which took place around from one continent to another supercontinent. You have 500 to 600 million years periodicity. So every 500, 600 million years, you produce a new supercontinent. So you break up one and you assemble another one. Now, what are the superplumes? Yes, as I say, I will define what the superplumes. So the superplumes are related to the LLSVPs. The LLSVPs, there are these regional thermal anomalies deep in the mantle, and actually these LLSVPs control the formation of the majority of the hotspot and lips on Earth. So on that map of the Earth, you have once again the tomographic image as 2,800 kilometers, and the red dots are the lips and hotspot on the present day configurations. And as you see, the majority of the hotspots, they are linked to the edge of the LSVPs. It is true for the African superplume and the Pacific superplumes. So when we call about superplumes, it's just this region, which is the source regions of the majority of the hotspots. It's not one big superplumes coming from down and producing like this massive volcanism. It's just like the source of the majority of all the hotspots that come from this region. This is a representation of the superplumes or the SVPs for the African and from the Pacific. So you can find this animation online. There is a link here. So this animation has been produced from a paper by Kotar et al. In 2016. So where they are giving this 3D image of the LSVP, and on that animation, which is very nice, you can see they are actually antipodal, and you can really see they are from each side of the Earth, below the Pacific and below Africa. So how do we know that the superplume or the LSVP are the source region of the majority of the hotspots? So we know that now it's already the case, but people think it has been the case for at least 200 million years. So on that map, you have, it's once again a tomography image with different threshold for the boundary of the LSVPs. So it is centered for the African one. And you have some dots and cross on that diagram. And dots and cross on that diagram, they are the position at time of replacement for the hotspots and lips for the last 200 million years. And interestingly, you see that most of them are closely linked to the edge of the LLSVPs. At least if you look at for the African, sorry, you see all these dots at the edge. And this is a major finding nearly 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when we find that we have the LSVPs controlling intraplate volcanism, basically. And because it's a case for the last 200 million years, it led the author to say, okay, so for a long time, we have the source region not moving. Okay, we are producing the hotspot in the same place. So these guys say maybe it's fixed. So the LSVPs below Africa or below Pacific, they are there for a very, very long time, and most probably from the beginning of the formation of the Earth. And then from that moment, it raised a kind of not a controversy, but I would say like a vigorous discussion, or I would say animated discussion between the people. I say, okay, the LSVP are fixed, they are not moving. And other people say, that's really strange, not moving. And by the way, we have proved that they are fixed, but only for 200 million years. And then we had a debate about, are the LSVP fixed or dynamic? It means, do we have something that's in core at the core mantle boundary, never moving? Or we have something that can react to what's going on in the mantle? We know we have supercontinental cycle, we have slabs, we have like convections. Is there a connection between that? And this idea of a dynamic LSVP or dynamic superplume, so a close connection between what's going on at the surface and what's going on at the core mantle boundary, came from a series of papers that came out pretty much at the same time. By Li et al. And Li and Zhong 2009. Okay, this is Li and Zhong, not Li et al. Li, Zhong and al. Okay, whatever. So in these papers, they had like geological evidence and also geodynamic modeling that show that you might have a connection between the formation and the location of the LSVPs and the formation and dismiss of the supercontinent. So I just realized I don't have the pointer on the. That's okay. I can't click on that. Oh, hey, yes, I can. Sorry, guys, I just have to. Yes, laser pointer. Okay, it works. Nice. Okay, so this is a representation of the geodynamic modeling. Okay, so this is the Earth. Okay, so this is the. Just imagine that just at the very beginning of the Earth, you have in blue, you have the downwellings or the slabs, and in yellow, orange-ish, you have the plumes, the upwellings. So at some point on the Earth, we have like what we call degree N convection mode. So we have like multiple downwellings, multiple upwellings, and at some point, this case will change to with the formation of the when you have more and more continents, you're gonna switch from something that is called this is degree 2, right? So we switch from only major upwelling, major downwelling, sorry, major upwelling. Okay, but when you're forming a supercontinent, you're forming a supercontinent here above a major upwelling when the Earth was in degree 1 convection mode. It means you have one major downwelling and one major upwelling here. So this is kind of makes sense. So to form the supercontinent, to bring all the masses on the same place, you just need to have somewhere you are going down. You know, you just sucking the continent in one places. Okay. Something very interesting. So when you form the supercontinent here, you're gonna have what we call the subduction girdle. So when you have the supercontinent is here, you're gonna have the subduction on the edge of the supercontinent. And the subduction slabs will go down and down and down, and we have proved that they can go down to the core mantle boundary. When they hit the core mantle boundary, they will interact with what's going on there, and they will produce a new degree 2 system. So we're gonna have like a upwelling producing here and a upwelling antipodal, right? So in this geodynamic modeling, we see that the formation of the supercontinent and the position of the supercontinent will control where you have this major upwelling in the mantle. So when you have like the superplumes. So this is the framework in which we can start to think. So fixed, where they are never moving, or dynamic, when you have a close link with supercontinent and plate tectonics. And after that time, when people start to think if there is a dynamic link, so people publish a lot of work that show that we might have a dynamic LSVP or superplume. So for example, in this Nature paper in 2016, Rakib Hassan made a geodynamic modeling, and he showed that here it's the cross-section of the Earth. He showed that the location of for a mantle plume, for example, for the formation of the Hawaii Emperor chain, if I'm correct, he showed that the expression of the plume at the surface were slightly moving through time, but it also showed that the plume and core at the LSVP, or core at the large low visibility province here, were also moving, and basically you have the entire plume moving. So that paper shows that to explain the formation of the Hawaiian Emperor chain, you have to have the root of the plume moving, okay? And they say most probably the entire LSVP may be moving as well, because the plume are anchored at the edge. More recently, basically last year, people are always working, working on the Emperor and Hawaii chain. Here on the right, you have this is the Emperor chain, and this is the Hawaiian chain. They did some paleomag analysis, and what they discovered is if you're using paleomag analysis, you can't explain the bend by only a change in the plate moving, switching position, okay? So what they show is the bend here cannot be reproduced by only changing the way the plates are just moving, okay? There have to be a relationship with the plume moving as well. And it's pretty much in the same line as the previous paper we see. And doing some calculations, and based on what they saw, they show that the LSVP can move up to 13 millimeter per year, which is kind of huge for geological time. And particularly what they show that the African LSVP here on this map were going southward at that rate, 13 millimeters per year. So these papers show that even on a very short period of time in the geological scale, there is something going on below, something is moving. The problem with this is we are stuck with what we have. So for the geological record, we have, for example, in the ocean or something like that. So we can't go beyond 200 million years or something like that, as you can see with the reconstructed hotspot and OIB. So the idea after that is to how we can have information about the connection between the superplane and the supercontinent through times. So it was the first part of the project when we came here, and we published 2 papers. I think important papers the last year and early this year. One in Nature Communication and one in Geology. So the Nature Com from Hamed, which is PhD student here. So he did a very impressive job by combining what we know about supercontinental cycles and the geochemistry of the rock. So he said, if we want to have an idea about what's going on, like the plume activity, we need to have a look at the geological and geochemical record of mantle plume to see if there is a correlation. If we have an intensity, more activity, more plume activity at certain period of time. And in another way, so what I did is just compile the evidence for the oceanic mantle plume, because when in the model we think we have antipodal, something going on below the continent, something happening in the ocean. And the idea was to combine this plume event in the ocean and to see if there is a correlation between supercontinent and plume activity. And this is the 2 main figures from these 2 papers. So from Nature Communication, so these figures here is basically the relative enrichment and depletion of key elements, because Hamed demonstrated that enrichment in key elements like chromium, nickel, and magnesium in basaltic rocks can give you information about the temperature and about what's going on. So basically, when you have like enrichment, relative enrichment compared to the baseline, you have a higher temperature in the mantle, so higher mantle plume activity. We interpreted the mantle plume activity. And very interestingly, we see that all this orange, which has the relative enrichment, so higher magnesium in the basals, higher nickel, higher chromium, are closely correlated with the tenure of the supercontinent. We have Nuna here, Rodinia here, Pangaea here. It works for magnesium, it works for nickel, it works for chromium. Using the oceanic record, what we see, we have here the oceanic large igneous province and OIB record for the last billion years, I would say, and compared to the continental lips, so the continental large igneous provinces, to see if there is a correlation between oceanic lips, continental lips, and the supercontinental cycles. And applying some cycle analysis to see if there is a cycles in our data sets, we show that we have a between 500 and 400 million year cycle for the oceanic plume record, and pretty much the same, 500 to 600 million years for the continental lip record. And interestingly, these lines are broadly aligned and coincide with, like the formation and breakup of the supercontinent. So these cycles, both the geological record for the last billion years and the data mining for the last 3 billion years, show a clear correlation between mantle plume activities and the supercontinental cycles. Therefore, from that, what we say, so we have an evidence for interaction between supercontinent and superplumes, right? And if you continue to think about it, the coupled supercontinent and superplume events, so they predict the feedbacks between Earth mantle and the lithosphere, right? So if we think we have like assembly of supercontinent, the slab and melting, we should see something, we should have evidence in the mantle, something should happen. And the idea come up to understand what's going on in the mantle. Do we have evidence in the mantle for such connection between what's going on in the surface and what's going on deep in the mantle. And the best way to look at the mantle, one of the best way to look at the mantle, is to look at mantle heterogeneity using the radiogenic isotopes. Sorry. So on that right diagram here, you have a lead isotope systematic. So you have like different isotopes here, isotope ratio, sorry, compared to another isotope ratio. And you can plot all the oceanic rocks you have on Earth, okay? So you have the MOBs and the OIB and large instrumentation. So why are we using only oceanic rocks? It's because they are free from continental contaminations. Because when basalts melting in the mantle going through the lithosphere, they're likely to be contaminated. So that's why we are looking at the oceanic rocks. So back in the 80s, people tried to look at these isotopes, right? And Dupré and Allègre in 1983 discovered something very interesting. They showed that there is a difference between the northern hemisphere basalts and the southern hemisphere basalts. And later, so 1 year later, Art decided to use this data to put it on the context of the Earth and look at the data here and try to look at the heterogeneity to see what's going on. So what they discovered is say, okay, most of the northern hemisphere basalts are producing a straight line on the lead isotope systematics. And we have some basalts that are above this line, okay? That's what Hart called the Dupas anomaly. So Dupas stands for Dupré, for Dupré and Allègre, very simple. So we have a Dupas anomaly, which is an enrichment in lead isotopes. But in terms of geography, we saw that most of the Dupas anomaly is on the southern hemisphere here. And Dupas anomaly is basically enrichment. So this guy discovered for the first time we have a large-scale heterogeneity in the mantle. And since then, people say, okay, we need to understand what's going on. We know we need to enrich the mantle, and there are several ways to do that: subductions, continental collisions, etc., etc. Then people continue to investigate the oceanic basalts and producing more and more data. And Castillo in 1986, so very shortly after that, discovered that within the Dupas anomaly in the southern hemisphere, actually you have another complexity, okay? You have the Dupas anomaly here, and on the Pacific, he described what he called the SOPITA, so South Pacific Isotopic Enterment Anomaly. So then the story starts to be more complicated than the north-south, dichotomy. And this intrinsic heterogeneity within the Dupas anomaly led the author to try to understand each different hotspots, to understand what their source, what's going on. And since then, people are looking for heterogeneity in the mantle. And for example, this is a very recent paper by Jackson et al. In 2017 on helium isotopes. You see that we have a deep connection between the autosys plume and the very high ratios in the mantle plumes. And using other isotopic system, it is try to see if there is like systematic enrichment, systematic a depletion, what's going on, what's the connection with the LSVP and the plumes. But as you can see here, so the signal is not that clear. There is no like a first order evidence for something going on here. So as I say, people try to focus directly on specific hotspots. For example, in that paper in 2011 on Hawaii, people discovered there is like two trends in Hawaii, and the Hawaiian mantle plume is heterogeneous, and try to understand what's going on that particular mantle plume, and try to see if there is like systematic differences and where does it come from, and having put that in the context of the SVPs and mantle upwelling and stuff like that. But as you can see, there is no clear answer. And why do we lack of answers is because we have a blur signal when you talk about isotopic system in the mantle. This is a lead isotope diagram, so 206, 204, 207, 204, compared to what we call here the northern hemisphere reference line. Remember the line that should be like the normal stuff, and everything above is the Dupas anomaly. And if you compare African domain and the Pacific domain, For reminder, the map is here, so to two domains. You see that's at the first scale, it's pretty much the same, okay? From the OIB, which have a deeper source, maybe from the lower mantle, and even for the MOB, we are shallower sourced on the upper mantle. You see that the signal is pretty much the same. But when you do that, when you try to compare all the plumes and all the MOBs all together on the same diagram, you're just forgetting one thing. You're just forgetting that plumes are not make equal. Okay, so I borrowed that from Chris Spencer. Is the fact that you can produce plumes in different ways. Okay, and the MOBs and the plumes and the YB, for example, are very different. So this is a diagram that show you the three main type of hotspots we can find on Earth, and you can also compare with the Mid-Ocean ridge. And you can see that you can produce hotspots from the upper mantle here, just melting here, forming here. You can form the hotspot right above the LSVPs, or what we call the super plumes, or you have the hotspot directly from the core mantle boundary, maybe away from the LSVP, going up through the surface and producing this hotspot. And you have the Mid-Ocean ridge, you are just the melting of the uppermost part of the upper mantle. So basically, if you want to understand what's going on deep in the mantle, you have to somehow filter the hotspots. And you don't want these guys. You don't want the Mid-Ocean ridge. The only guy you want is the hotspot from the core mantle boundary, or the hotspot linked to the LSVPs here, or the super plumes. And the big question is how to do that. How can we filter this OIB? So what we did, is say, okay, we will use the Couture et al. 2003 framework, okay? So Couture et al. Say, okay, we have different type of hotspots, and we might have a way to discriminate them using different criteria, and which is the temperature, which is the helium isotopic composition, this is the geological history, etc., etc. So you have a list of different criteria, and you can apply this criteria for a list of hotspots here. On that work, he didn't discriminate oceanic and continental ones. But anyway, what we did is just update this list using the most recent data we had for helium isotope, for example, or for using the most recent tomographic models. So for example, in that diagram, we have you see this. People try to see if we have a deep connection between a hotspot and the core mantle boundary or the edge of the LSVP. So updating this list, updating this parameter for helium for tomography using different tomographic catalog, we were able to filter and update this list, and we come up with basically 4 OIB or large induced province in the African domain, and 4 for the Pacific domain. So in this map of the Earth, you have the image of the LSVP at 2,800 kilometers, and in the big circle here are the deep sourced OIB or OLIP, right? So to do that, you need to be sure of what you're doing, right? So for example, we had to look at each individual hotspot to see what their history is. There some complexity, and where this complexity come from? And one of the biggest problem here are Samoa. So Samoa is 6. So Samoa is here because Samoa is very peculiar OIB, for example, because it has higher helium ratios. It has a strong deep connection to the core mantle boundary. But the problem is it's also one of the well-defined OIB with a plume and slab interaction. So if you put that into context for the leaded isotopes, we see that we have someone basals here. They are very weird. We have this enrichment, but we can't say if this enrichment come from the deep source or from the slab interaction. So, for example, we had to exclude Samoa because the signal from Samoa is not very clear, and we don't have any clue if these isotopic composition are from the slab or from the deep source. This is why we excluded it. And we did that for a couple of a couple of OIB. So we just have a look at each of them. So we gathered the data from the main database, so GeoRock and EarthChem, using a different filter. So we just focused on broadly basaltic rocks, and we filtered the 6,000 sample into the deep source OIB and the other OIB. And as you see, you have like a considerable number of samples for each. And we also filter from their local history, as I say. And Kerguelen is a very good example. So we have people here at Curtin working on Kerguelen, so for a pretty long time, I would say. And they are specialists of the island, and they show that the complexity in some large Indus provinces can come from the early history of the plume. Okay, in that diagram, what you see here, you have like lithospheric interaction in the older bits of the basalt from the Kerguelen plume, because Kerguelen plume was there for the breakup of Gondwana, and then you have interaction with the lithosphere or the crust. It's still debate, but then after a certain time, so after 95 million years, you have like a more mantle-like source. So, for example, for Kerguelen, we excluded all the older rocks from Kerguelen to make sure that we don't have this complexity. And this is the results we have. So for here in the right, we have the African domain, we have the Pacific domain. And to make sure that we are looking at something that sounds statistically reasonable, we apply a kernel density plots here to see where are the majority of the samples. Okay. And what we see on these two diagrams, for example, we see that generally the African domain is above the NHRL, while the Pacific domain are more here, close to what we call the prevalent mantle, so the normal composition of the mantle. And at first order, we see that we have an African domain and a Pacific domain that have a very distinct composition for the tip source OIB. And this was one of the main conclusions of the paper. So we have two different types of mantle domains. So one is enriched, one is more mantle, more normal, I would say. And the African one here is the one that is enriched. So the question is how to enrich this mantle domain, how to enrich the deeper source of the mantle domain. So we did a very we did a simple, it's not rough, it's simple mixing modeling. So when you look at the diagram here, you see that you have a UCC, which is the upper continental crust, which is here as well. And you see here, you have like the prevalent mantle, so the composition of the normal mantle. So what we did, we say, okay, what's going on? What's the evolution of the upper crust? Okay, what's the evolution of the normal mantle, right? And we modeled the evolution of this mantle from the last 2.5 billion years up to today. And what we see here is the range for 700 million years to today, right? And this space here would be the mixing between the normal mantle and the upper continental crust, which is represented by this gray area in each diagram here. So we show that we have like a mix between the mantle and something that as old as 700 million years to today. Okay, and once we get to that age, we say what's going on at that time. And very interestingly, this time is not like random in Earth history, because this 700 million years, it's after the breakup of Rodinia and before the assembly of and until the assembly of Pangaea. So we had a time period where you have the breaking up of Rodinia and assembly of Pangaea, which coincide with enrichment of the African domain, the deep source of the deep mantle in the African domain. So how to put that into context? So what we need now is to use paleogeographic reconstructions to see where they were. Where were Rodinia, where were Pangaea? And luckily for us, in last year, Lee and co-author, they published a paper where they showed the evolution from Nuna, Rodinia to Pangaea on Earth. And what they demonstrate in that paper, they show that when you're here, so 1.6 billion years ago, you have Nuna on one side of the Earth, right? So you have Nuna, which is basically here, and it starts to break up, but the breakup was not complete. Okay, we have a unsuccessful breakup, and when Rodinia, just after Nuna reformed, it formed pretty much at the same place of Nuna, right? It's mean like during that time, so from Nuna assembly, Nuna breakup, Rodinia assembly, we have one part of the Earth which concentrate the land masses, and the other was like a super ocean. Okay. But when you have the transition from Rodinia to Pangaea, you have what we call a extroversion, so complete breakup. So Rodinia breakup, and basically Pangaea form on the other side of the Earth. This is what we call the super ocean model, because we have one super ocean here, which stay for 2 billion years, and then we form a new super ocean when you just do the extroversion. New super ocean would be now here, which is now the Pacific. So when you do that, you have a massive reorganization of the plates, right? And to do that, you have to, if you start here, you have Rodinia, which is here, you need to break up. And so all the land masses here, so it's going that direction, so here, all the land masses coming here and will collide at that time here. And to do that, you have major subductions and major collision. You have formation of Gondwana, you have subduction, you have the Pan-African, and you have evidence for bringing a lot of continental material inside the mantle when you're forming Pangaea. And this didn't happen when you have like only Nuna here, Rodinia, and then Pangaea. So using the reconstructions and just showing where the mantle domain should be at the time. So we start here. You have here after the breakup of Rodinia, you have the future Pacific domain, and you have the super ocean, which is the future African domain. Okay, and then you start to do the extroversion. You form Gondwana, and then you have the collision of and tenure of Pangaea. And if you look at here, you have here the subduction girdle here. That would bring all the continental material from Rodinia, from Pangaea, sorry, below this mantle domain here. And then after that, you have the breakup, and the mantle domain and the girdle remains. So from using the isotopes, using some filtering, some statistics, and the paleogeography, we came to these conclusions, these two main conclusions from the paper. So the subduction polarity associated with the supercontinental cycle and superocean evolution can best explain why the African mantle domain is contaminated with continental crustal material, whereas the Pacific domain has been protecting from such contamination for the past 600 million years. And then the deep mantle geochemical dichotomy, which is now west-east, not north, the south and north and south, that the two mantle domain may have been geodynamically and chemically coupled with the supercontinental cycle, and this suggests a dynamic link instead of the stationary nature of the mantle structure and composition. And that's it. Thanks.
Well done, Luc. It was a very nice talk. Let me just pause recording. Stop recording. Stop that. Stop the recording.